Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Today we're going to talk about affirmative action as it involves the hiring of public safety employees in LaPorte and Indianapolis. We're also going to talk about the campaign finance scandal involving Fort Wayne Mayor Winfield Moses. And we're going to talk about the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, its author, former U.S. Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, and its application during President Reagan's recent illness. Panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable include Cecil Bohannon from Economics, commenting on affirmative action in Indiana, Dwight Hoover from History, commenting on Birch Bayh, George Bush, and the 25th Amendment, and John Rouse from Political Science, commenting on Winfield Moses' campaign finance scandal. Cecil Bohannon, what is affirmative action and why is it news?
Well, I think there's an American ideal that says in any organization where people are going to be promoted, where salary decisions are going to be made, that salary decisions, promotions ought to be made based upon merit and not upon race, color, creed, or any other arbitrary criteria. Of course, the problem there is not everyone has a broad-minded, unbigoted view of the world. We don't always find that happening. There have been systematic discrimination against blacks. There's been systematic discrimination against women, one way or another, throughout the history of this country. What affirmative action is an attempt to try to correct those kind of imbalances by really going the other way, saying you must hire a particular amount of blacks and a particular number of women. Now, my own personal view on that is, in general, affirmative action programs aren't a good idea. There's nothing more than quota systems, where we arbitrarily use the state to say that if X percentage of particular numbers in the workforce have to be women, they have to be black or whatever. In general, I don't think that's advisable. I don't think it helps blacks. I don't think it helps women. In some ways, it ends up being reverse discrimination. In some ways, it's counter to the interest of blacks and women that are trying to make it ahead. But I would argue that in a private firm that's running for profit, such as an IBM, such as a Xerox, some company like that, it's not really going to pay the managers of those corporations who are trying to maximize profits to do anything except promote based upon real merit. It doesn't really pay someone, say, to advance a white when a black's more qualified if you're trying to make profit. Now, on the other hand, I think if we look at the cases that have popped up in Indiana, up in LaPorte, and also the one in Indianapolis, what we have to remember on those is that we're not dealing with private corporations that are ostensibly making an attempt to maximize profits. What we're dealing with are public agencies, and it's not exactly clear what public agencies are trying to do. And what I would argue as an economist is that the ability for the manager in the public agency to, in a very arbitrary and capricious manner, promote exclusively because of race, I think there's a lot more latitude for that in a public agency, because the public agency isn't monitored by the marketplace, it's not monitored by the profit motive. So even though in general I'm personally opposed to quotas, I'm not exactly sure they're a bad idea in the public sector. I think the black policemen in Indianapolis really have a point. If you look at the percentage of blacks that have made it to higher supervisory positions, it is relatively low. If you look at the Fraternal Order of Police, the number of people that are on the upper boards of that organization that are black are relatively low.
The system that has excluded blacks and has excluded women has been discriminatory to one side. I mean, that is what we're trying to correct through affirmative action.
Sure.
And affirmative action is indeed reverse discrimination. It is saying we're not going to look at merit, we're going to look
Absolutely.
See, so, excuse me, but from the political point of view or from the constitutional legal point of view, quotas are illegal according to the Botke Supreme Court decision of 1978. The decision did say that hiring agencies could use race as a consideration. But that's not my question or point, really. What's the difference then between equal opportunity and affirmative action?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Again, I think the ideal of equal opportunity says that everyone should have a fair shot one way or another. What affirmative action is saying is, wait a minute, we can go measure how fair a shot people had by the results that come out of hiring decisions. That if you have, say, a police department in a small town where 25% of the population is black, and you never notice a black ever being promoted to anything, then even if you can't document particular discrimination, even if you can't say, well, so-and-so was discriminated against, you have fairly much a prima facie case to say some discriminations happen. And the way you correct that is you go in and you say you have to have so many blacks at that particular point in time. Now, I don't think that's particularly fair. It's not fair, particularly.
Well, it seems to me from what you're saying that affirmative action then is remedial training, so to speak, to bring certain individuals up to the starting line so they can have an equal opportunity to go in the race.
Affirmative action isn't intended to be fair. I mean, it's
exactly.
designed to be
Precisely.
unfair to correct whatever inequities there were before.
But the problem is that there's disagreement on what the limit is. That is to say, people who will support affirmative action won't support quotas. That is, where do you draw the line? And the argument for people like Nathan Glazer, for example, is that you stop at quotas, that you don't permit the imposition of quotas. So that's become a kind of philosophic point, I think.
I mean, isn't affirmative action simply supposed to be, quote, guidelines compared to quotas, which are very rigid and very strict? And I think the line's fairly not very distinct.
And the argument is that Glazer's argument is that all we can promise anybody is equality of opportunity. From that point, you're on your own.
And I think the surprising thing, especially here in Indiana, where we have a conservative political environment, there is such support for affirmative action, especially in a place like Indianapolis.
Well, again, I would argue that in the political realm, it's much easier for the political bureaucrat to engage in capricious and arbitrary action in terms of salary decisions and in terms of hiring decisions than it is for the private bureaucrat, simply because the profit-maximizing motive isn't as profound in the public sector. I think that's really the question. What we really mean by discrimination is arbitrary and capricious action.
Well, the hiring motive in the public sector is spoils. I mean, it is political reward.
Precisely. I think that's probably the primary motivation. And I think in that kind of system, it's probably easier for the manager to indulge in, say, some kind of racial prejudice or some kind of sexual prejudice than it is in the private sector.
I think I disagree with that. I think bureaucracies are about the same, whether they're in a corporation or in the government, that indeed you get the same kinds of things operative in both circumstances.
I don't really think
I disagree.
I disagree. I don't think the manager
this
at
hasn't been my
Xerox has to
experience.
look at the private. I mean, I think he has to look at the private line. The guy at Xerox that, say, has a sales team of 20 people, he's got to look at the private line.
But
the
suppose-
bottom line.
It's more than the bottom line, it's the law. Everybody in the public sector is governed by the law, because the law tells the person in the public sector everything that person can do. It only tells the person in the private sector what he cannot do. So the key difference is the fact that everyone who works for the public sector is governed by law.
Well, so is everybody
in the private sector. You're just saying the laws are different, John, right?
Absolutely different. If you take the basic illustration, when we go out onto the highway and we go 56 miles an hour, they tell us not to go beyond 55. We are only told what we cannot do. That policeman who arrests you for going 56 miles an hour, he is governed completely by the law.
Well,
So
89.9% of the people exceed the speed limit. This is a recent statistic, so people aren't obeying that law.
I'm not sure I follow you, Dwight.
But-
What are you trying to say?
Well, I'm trying to say that just because the law is there, it doesn't mean that people abide by it.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, the government agency might be, quote, ruled by law, but I know a lot of lawless government agencies. You know, if you look at the way some public sector bureaucrats act.
Let
And
me
some of the
bring you
things they
back
do.
to another question, though. It seems to me what affirmative action has tried to do is to promote an old girls' school or an old black school as opposed to the old boy school. You know,
Well, I think you've got a good point there.
So
I don't deny.
So it's politics, however you make it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question of that people will play games with the affirmative action, and people will do things to try to get themselves in affirmative action positions where they can advance themselves.
Is the Reagan
And I don't think
administration
that's particular. See, I suppose my position would have to be one of neutrality. I don't trust the public sector to do a very good job of engaging in what I would consider to be non-capricious hiring. But on the other hand, I'm not exactly sure affirmative action is a good alternative.
minorities might say that the Reagan administration position in this area is predictable. In fact, that in Indianapolis anyway, they're fighting the quota system that William Hudnett, the mayor, and that they're pursuing to get more blacks in the system. Is that indicative of the Reagan administration? I mean, is this an indictment?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in some sense, I think the Reagan administration tries to fulfill the criteria of fairness, but I think they definitely are a backlash against the affirmative action programs and policies of previous administrations. I don't think there's any question of that. I don't think there's any question of that at all, that typically Reagan Republican types aren't going to be as sympathetic to affirmative action in either the public or the private sector as liberal Democrat Jimmy Carter types.
Cecil, I'm just surprised that the entire concept of affirmative action has been institutionalized as it has been over the last 15 years. And it seems to me that the Reagan administration would do everything possible not to emphasize this kind of concept.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's what, I mean, I think they're basically against that. I think, but again, I mean, I think the argument for affirmative action is what's the other alternative? Can you consistently have public sector, or any employees, consistently discriminated against?
Well, I think the argument is simply politics, and women and blacks want their share of the political system.
Sure.
Before we get too far from
And
Reagan,
affirmative action is a way of ensuring it happens.
before we get too far from Reagan and the law, let's talk about the 25th Amendment of the Constitution. The recent Reagan illness brought this to some questions to whether, in fact, it was even invoked, Dwight Hoover. I mean, did we, in fact, see practice of the 25th Amendment?
Sure, I think so. There's no other constitutional basis for assigning the power to a vice president, I think.
What does the 25th Amendment say, and what's its reason for being?
Well, the 25th Amendment merely provides for succession of the vice presidency to assume the presidential office during certain kinds of circumstances. There are several sections. The section that's most concerned is the one where the president voluntarily relinquishes control over the office to the vice president.
Which we had in this case.
Right. But there are other provisions which allow Congress or the other agencies of the government to determine that it should be relinquished. That is, there are times, say, the president was completely physically incapacitated or mentally incapacitated, then somebody else would have to make a decision that the president was incapable of carrying on. So it's a proviso for the orderly transition of power from the president to the vice president.
If this is so important, why is it no older than it was? I mean, we did have a system for succession of somewhat before Birch Bayh of Indiana, in fact, authored this amendment, didn't we?
Well, it's an interesting question because it has to do with what is the role of the vice president when the president's not able to serve. I mean, can you get along without a president? Is the vice president an acting president? What happens when a president dies, for example? Is the vice president an acting president, or has he become president? We know in the 19th century we had a number of vice presidents who became president, and then there was no vice president. But that's an overt case, and mostly occurring when the president dies of natural causes or assassination. Recently, we've had cases that have been more questionable. The case of Woodrow Wilson is a good example. He had a stroke, and he was obviously physically incapacitated, and his wife ran the presidency. She handled it. In Eisenhower's administration, he had 3 periods of illness. He had a heart attack, he had ileus, he had stroke. And in each of those particular circumstances, there was some question about who was running the country. Was Nixon running the country? And it was never clear. Actually, the impetus for the 25th Amendment came with the assassination of Kennedy. When did Johnson take over? There was some question about when Kennedy was brain dead. When does Johnson become president? And Johnson himself, when he was president, had a gallbladder operation. If you recall that particular circumstance, who was in control when Johnson was under the ether? So the real problem is that in today's world, when a decision may have to be made in a matter of minutes, you need somebody who is the titular head of the government. And so that was what the 25th Amendment was designed to do.
Dwight, is this an issue that is followed very closely by the person? I don't like to refer to the average person because there is no average person, but do citizens follow this kind of issue very closely, you think?
Or is this just for historians and political scientists to discuss?
Yeah.
I think it only becomes a problem when something happens. If you recall what happened when there was this attempt on Reagan's life in '81, Haig said he was in control, which of course he wasn't by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think Haig knew what the 25th Amendment was. And I think very few people are informed on it. And nothing happens until something happens. In this case, what happened was that Reagan decided to make some kind of provision when he was under the ether. Again, being very careful not to set a precedent. This was the problem. He wanted to use it and he didn't want to use it, so he was caught on the horns of a dilemma.
Well, isn't the difference in my history, in my remembrance, my lifetime, it seems as though when the president goes under, it's obviously a rather short-term thing. When Lyndon Johnson went under the ether, he knew he was going to be up in a few hours. Ronald Reagan is very fortunate not only to be politically resilient, but also physically resilient, and that he's entertaining leaders from China 3 days after the operation, practically. Isn't the real test going to come, God forbid, in the future, if he were to develop some serious continual illness?
Yeah.
And then what would happen in that case? Would it be a power-sharing arrangement? Would he resign? Or?
Well, that's a difficult circumstance. The way the amendment is worded, it leaves some question as to the extent to which the president can control these activities. To what extent can he say, no, I'm ill and I don't want to continue, or can he say, on the other hand, yes, I'm perfectly all right, I will want to continue? It becomes even more questionable when, if it should happen, if he became mentally ill.
Well, ultimately, who has the decision as to whether or not the president's competent? I mean, we all know stories. Most of us in our families have elderly relatives who still think of themselves as being completely competent, who are, quote, out of it. How is that be decided? What would happen if, quote, the president lost it? Who would decide?
Well, Section 4 says that the cabinet will decide, but then the president can overrule them. So it's a circular argument. It's an argument that it's never been tested. The way it's worded, I think it would be very difficult to determine who was in charge.
You decide my sanity, but then I can veto you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
If you look at the relationship, the person who is chief of staff, his name Donald Reagan, also George Bush, of course, the vice president. It seems that the president's staff might have a lot more influence over continuing power and maintaining power than the vice president, especially if there were bad relations, say, or not good relations, at least, between the vice president and the president's staff. Well, I mean, for example, going back in history, we know that the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy was not all that close.
Oh, that's true.
And of course, all this has occurred since that time.
You're suggesting a presidential grab, a vice presidential grab for power?
I'm suggesting that perhaps the vice president and the president have a falling out, or yet perhaps the staff, or the White House staff, and the vice president do not see eye to eye. There's conflict among those people, and so therefore you have conflict as to who is going to be in charge. Of course, the Constitution settles that.
Yeah, I don't think you have any question if the president is incapacitated, but the question of deciding is a real problem. The vice president might very well be accused of a grab for power.
Sure.
I don't know how you can avoid that particular
Except it would look very bad on the vice president in the next election if he was seen as a little power grabber that persecuted the poor president when the poor president was down and out. There's some constraints in the political system.
Yeah, in any case, it's primarily an academic matter because, as we know with the Reagan-Bush arrangement, Bush didn't do anything when he was acting president. He didn't sign any bills. He didn't take any actions, anything
didn't
that
even
was...
go to any funerals. Right?
That's right. His wife wasn't the president's wife. She had no receptions. Nothing happened. So the staff carried on as before. So there really wasn't any activity that he had to take. Again, the question is, why did they take the action that they did? We know Reagan had two letters, one which invoked the 25th Amendment and the one that he sent which didn't invoke the 25th Amendment. By the proviso of the 25th Amendment, he has to write a letter to the Speaker of the House and the Chairman of the Senate, in the case of the Vice President, saying he's going to do this. He didn't invoke the 25th Amendment. And again, the argument from the White House was he didn't want to set a precedent in case somebody was having a tooth pulled that they wouldn't have to turn over power.
Yeah, I think the importance of all this, and sometimes you might wonder why should all this be written down, but I think when you have something written down, you have less chance for conflict later on or misunderstanding. So I think that's the reason for having this particular provision written in.
talk about who's in charge. There is no question, John Rouse, who is in charge in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It is Winfield Moses, a man who can plead guilty to misdemeanor charge of campaign finance violations and turn around a week later and, after resigning the office, be reelected in a caucus. Is that amazing, or is that politics?
It's not amazing, I don't think, when you consider Indiana politics. The provision is that if something happens to the mayor, I think it's also true in this county, that there will be a meeting of the precinct committee people from the area, the county, the city, and they will elect a successor. So, to answer the first question, it was not amazing, given the politics. And again, this was the rule or the provision.
The special prosecutor who, in fact, took this to court, who agreed to the plea bargain agreement, said this is like Richard Nixon resigning and taking off in his helicopter on the south lawn of the White House and landing on the north lawn and then going back in the White House. Is that comparable?
Well, there are comparisons, and the comparisons deserve to be analyzed because the first charge was a felony charge. And the difference in terms of this particular issue was that how much intent did the mayor of Fort Wayne have in giving campaign monies to a fellow by the name of Boris Jeremenko, who was running for sheriff. The mayor wanted to get a certain person elected because the opponent of this person was going to be his opponent in the next election.
A Republican.
A Republican.
Winfield Moses is a Democrat, and he was supporting a Republican for sheriff who was running against the incumbent Republican sheriff who was going to run as a Republican candidate for mayor against the Democrat Moses.
So if you think...
a little political chess moving, really.
If you're confused by this issue, you certainly have a right to be, but the bottom line on that is that the Democrat Party across the state and also in Allen County is not very strong. So the mayor then was making a deal with the Republican because that was the only deal he could make, if indeed he made it. Now according to a result of the entire thing was that it was a misdemeanor, it was neglect, it was incompetence, it was nonfeasance, and instead it was not a felony, it was not a conspiracy, it was not malfeasance. Now, if it had been the others, he could have perhaps spent as much as 32 years in prison and paid $80,000 in fine and also had a lengthy trial. What the mayor had to do was that he agreed to, through the process, that there would be 3 misdemeanor charges, that he hid political contributions, he paid $3,000, he received 3 suspended 180-day jail sentences. So he got off lightly.
And he resigned.
And he did resign.
Now, John, did the prosecutor get hoodwinked on this? Did Moses just outsmart him? Or was it the case the prosecutor never really was after Moses that much? What's the prosecutor's role? Is the prosecutor here a Republican that's out to get Win Moses?
No, I don't think so. I think he probably thought he would not again contest for election.
Mm-hmm.
But
so Moses
they
just outsmarted
a special prosecutor in from out of Allen County.
I see.
So it was not an in-county political.
Could he have done this? I mean, could a prosecutor say, in the future you must do this and so, or is that permissible?
I'm sorry, Dwight, I don't understand your question.
That is, can that be a condition of any kind of arrangement?
Sure. Yeah, in the plea bargain, it could have been a condition. But again, the base consideration of all these things is politics. I think the greater issue is this image that this portrays in terms of politics in Indiana. I think it's the whole issue of campaign financing is perhaps the most serious issue that we face in terms of politics. And that's one concern. I think also as we look at the community, no one really stands up for the community. And what the mayor has done is that he has been very good in the eyes of most people who live in Fort Wayne for the community. For example, he has brought a General Motors plant there. He has revitalized the downtown area. The flood in '82 was a big issue. So no one really wants to stand up for the community because everyone stands up for individual selfish interest.
He's a very personable, affable, popular politician in Fort Wayne. I suppose the problem with respect to campaign financing laws is that ultimately the court of public opinion lets affable, popular politicians, quote, get away with things that other run-of-the-mill politicians can't.
Well, I think the short-term answer on that is that he is good for Fort Wayne, but the question is, will he be good for any place else besides Fort Wayne? And I think this has hurt his political career if he does have those kinds of ambitions.
Well, he did have ambitions. There were talk about him running for the United States Senate against Dan Quayle in '86. Talk about him running for governor 2 years ago. So the man obviously has suffered, even if he is still the mayor of Fort Wayne.
Well, Larry, I think it shows just how badly the Democratic Party is in terms of its condition when a Democrat has to make a deal with a Republican in the Republican primary. I mean, if the mayor serves out this third term or second term, however you want to look at it, he will be the first Democrat mayor in this century to fulfill 2 complete terms there in Fort Wayne. So I think in terms of campaign finance and in general organization, it just tells you how badly organized and the poor shape of the Democratic Party across the state.
We'll leave it there. We're out of time for today. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dwight Hoover, Cecil Bohannon, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborn. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.